Hi everyone, this is Scott. For maps, references, and images for each episode, as well as links to all my social media, please go to ancientworldpodcast.com. And if you'd like to support the show, please go to patreon.com/theancientworld. Thanks again for listening. Akkadian kings were a narcissistic bunch. And I'm not just talking about the statues and monuments. I mean that each king was 100% focused on their own personal deeds and accomplishments, to the point where none of them even mentioned their predecessors or ancestors in any of their inscriptions. Naram-Sin wasn't Naram-Sin, son of Manishtushu, grandson of Sargon the Great. He was just Naram-Sin the Mighty, king of the four quarters of the earth. No Akkadian royal tomb has ever been found. They certainly had them, but they didn't get the same attention as palaces or temples or administrative buildings. And they were certainly never mentioned in royal inscriptions. A focus on tombs would mean looking backward and shining a light on one's predecessors. By the same token, Akkadian kings didn't repeat conquests or complete construction projects. Each accomplishment was entirely novel, performed from scratch by each king. Which explains why Naram-Sin didn't start off his reign by addressing how he put his father to rest or how he dealt with his murderers. That'd mean admitting that he'd inherited his mantle. And even worse, that he'd inherited it from someone imperfect enough to allow himself to be killed. Don't get me wrong, I'm 100% sure that his father was entombed, most likely in Akkad, and the assassins were, decisively dealt with. But on paper, or in stone, Naram-Sin had simply arrived on the scene to take up his destined role. The Akkadian Empire was a tabula rasa, waiting for Naram-Sin to make the first mark. And that he would definitely do. Naram-Sin's 37 years of rule are considered the zenith of the Akkadian Empire. One reason is that even though he was unquestionably the dynasty's most energetic and successful warrior king, he wasn't just focused on warfare. He was also an accomplished diplomat who forged alliances, mostly through marriage, with a slew of powerful kingdoms, and a talented administrator who streamlined imperial operations. His reign also saw the high point of Mesopotamian art, including the king's own magnificent bust, which I've adopted for my podcast logo. For those of you watching the millennial clock, Naram-Sin was the last Mesopotamian ruler unaffected by the 4.2 kiloyear BPE aridification event. And it really showed. The king's successes on every front, crushing enemies, securing alliances, obtaining resources, opening trade routes, and developing imperial infrastructure, positioned the empire for a long, successful run. And who knows, absent major climate change, the Akkadian Empire may have endured well into the second millennium, or even longer. But alas, that fate just wasn't in the cards. Let's start things off with the king's own words, where he introduces himself as Naram-Sin the Mighty, king of Akkad, builder of the temple of Ishtar in Zabala. When the four quarters of the earth attacked him together, then did he conquer all of the peoples and mountains, from beyond the lower sea all the way to the upper sea, and brought their kings in fetters before Enlil. Naram-Sin the Mighty, in Enlil's fray, showed mercy to no one in those battles. In another inscription, Naram-Sin affirms his control over all the land of Elam as far as Marhashi, and the land of Subartu as far as the cedar forest. He smashed the weapons of all of Subartu. The city rulers of Subartu and the lords of the upper lands brought their offerings before him. To highlight the scope of his northern conquest, the king relates that he reached Hash-Lahash, the source of the Tigris, and also the source of the Euphrates. Here's another fun one. Whereas for all time since the establishment of the human race, no king among all kings whatsoever had destroyed Armanum and Ebla, by means of the weapons of the god Dagon, who magnifies his kingship, Naram-Sin the Mighty conquered Armanum and Ebla. From the head of the Euphrates to Ulishum, he smote the people whom Dagon had given to him for the first time, and they performed service for Ilaba, his god. When the god Dagon determined the verdict for Naram-Sin the Mighty, he delivered into his hands Rid-Adad, king of Armanum. When Naram-Sin personally captured the king in the entranceway to his palace, he fashioned a statue of himself in diorite and dedicated it to Sin at Ur. A couple quick things about Armanum, which, by the way, you will never hear of again. Syrian cities, including Armanum, were known for their massive walls, much thicker and higher than those of Mesopotamia. Naram-Sin was so impressed that he included the dimensions of Armanum's walls in his inscriptions, and also incorporated massive walls into later Akkadian construction. Also, some nice color about King Rid-Adad leading a final valiant and doomed defense from the entranceway of his own palace. Naram-Sin ends the text with, "May no one remove my inscription. The deed I perform is too great to surpass," which I'm sure is exactly what the Amorites thought as they lost another market for their sheep. To round things out, at least for the moment, Naram-Sin reaffirms his domination of Ebla, Mari, Tutul, Urkesh, and the mountains where the cedars are cut, and all their lands, as well as the land of Subartu, the shores of the upper sea, and Magan and all its lands beyond the lower sea. Magan he smote, then captured Manium, lord of Magan, and cut diorite stones in their mountains and brought them to Akkad and made a statue of himself. A lot to take in and a lot to unpack, but I'm sure you get the main thrust. Some places he mentions are familiar, and despite the king's claims, were clearly repeats of previous Akkadian conquests. In terms of new conquests, he mentions Subartu a number of times. Subartu refers to the vast swath of northern territory between the Zagros Mountains in the east and northern Syria in the west. In fact, Subartu basically just means north, and joined the Amorite west, the Elamite east, and the Sumerian south to make up the 4 quarters of the earth. In episode A2, I discussed how a people called the Kura Araxes had quickly expanded to settle Subartu in the wake of the Uruk contraction. I also noted that, based on the language they spoke, they're likely equivalent to the Hurrians. By the mid-23rd century BC, the Hurrians had founded a number of prominent cities throughout Subartu. Nineveh may have been a Hurrian foundation, named for a Hurrian fish goddess whose cult was subsumed by Ishtar. West of the Tigris, the Hurrians dominated a strip of territory along the lower ridges of the Taurus Mountains, particularly along the upper Euphrates and its main northern tributary, the Kabur. Like Elam looked toward the Persian plateau rather than the Mesopotamian plain, the Hurrian cities of this region looked north toward the Anatolian plateau, a region rich in highland resources like timber, stone, and metal. The highlands were dotted with numerous villages, and as far as we can tell, the cities relied on cultural ties, rather than coercion or military force, to access the resources needed to trade with the south. Of all the Hurrian cities of this region, the most important were Nagar and Urkesh. In his northern campaigns, Naram-Sin records defeating a king of Urkesh named Tishatal and destroying the kingdom of Nagar, with the latter, of course, being yet another lost market for Amorite pastoralists. Afterward, Naram-Sin raised an enormous fortress-like building at Nagar, with walls over 30 feet thick, similar to the massive administrative complex that Sargon had built at Eshnunna. Per Benjamin J. Foster, the complex was designed for the purpose of Akkadian domination and administration of the newly conquered region, as well as a base for operations further north and west. To the east, Naram-Sin dedicated much of his reign to fighting the tribes of the Zagros, the mountains extending from southeastern Anatolia right down to the Persian Gulf. While the southernmost reaches were dominated by Elam, the remainder hosted a variety of tribal confederations. The most commonly referenced were the Guti, invariably cast in Mesopotamian sources as uncouth, disruptive barbarians. Actually, Guti may have been a general term for people who came from the Zagros. It was still being used 1,400 years later to refer to the Medes and Manaeans. Somewhat better defined were the Lulubi, a tribe dominating the northern Zagros region of modern Iraqi Kurdistan, basically the territories of the Diyala and lower Zab river valleys. In the sources, both the Guti and Lulubi were mainly familiar as nomadic pastoralists and sources of cattle and slaves. What made the Lulubi different and special was that their native lands of Hurti and Kimash straddled a major trade route between Mesopotamia and the resource-rich Persian plateau. Naram-Sin waged several campaigns to try to conquer these territories. While not mentioned in many Akkadian inscriptions, the Lulubi do have a starring role in one of the most famous works of Akkadian art, the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, which, I should mention, I finally got to see up close this January. The stele, which is around 2 meters high, is dominated by an oversized Naram-Sin, carrying a bow, axe, and lance, striding atop the bodies of dead enemies. He's wearing a type of horned helmet usually reserved for the gods, while other gods, in the form of stars, shine down in obvious favor. Per Foster, the stele may have originally shown 9 Akkadian soldiers, their number and varied armament representing the 9 tactical units of the Akkadian army. The Lulubi, also 9 in number, carry similar weapons, but are distinguished from the Akkadians by their dress, hairstyle, and facial hair. The Lulubi king, shown smaller than Naram-Sin, clasps his hands to beg for mercy while one of his men dies in agony at his feet, a lance piercing his throat. As a statement of intent, it's hard to get more clear. Another work depicts Naram-Sin bare-chested and wearing the same horned helmet, enthroned next to Ishtar on the summit of her Ulmash temple. Per Foster, she hands him the lead ropes of defeated peoples, among them Elam and Marhashi. Again, the connotations seem fairly obvious. But then, in another royal inscription, Naram-Sin calls himself the husband of Ishtar Anonitum. Putting himself on the same level as Ishtar, visually and matrimonially, is a whole new type of assertion. So, what exactly was going on here? To provide the necessary context, I need to cover the Great Revolt, the only genuine threat to Naram-Sin's reign. We don't know when to place the revolt chronologically. It could have happened right after Manish-Tushu's death, as Naram-Sin ascended the throne, or sometime into his reign. Either way, the king describes the event in detail in the longest preserved Akkadian inscription. He starts by relating that in Kish they raised up Ifur Kish to kingship, And in Uruk, they raised up Amar-Girid to kingship. So basically the two most prominent Mesopotamian cities had gone into revolt. The Kishite king raised forces from several central Mesopotamian cities, including Kutha, Sippar, Borsippa, and Kazalu, and also enlisted, quote, the Amorite Highlanders, which is the first recorded mention of Amorites supplementing their decimated livelihood by hiring themselves out as mercenaries. Naram-Sin reports that he fought the rebels in the field of Sin, possibly near Ur, where, by the verdict of Ishtar Anunetum, Naram-Sin was victorious over the Kishite. He lists several slain or captive governors, generals, and officers, but the rebel king himself managed to escape. After pursuing Ifur-Kish up north to Kish and fighting him a second time, Naram-Sin records a second victory, with a second list of slain officials and captured officers and soldiers. He then seized Kish, tore down its walls, and diverted the Euphrates to flood the city. Kish's prominent role in the Great Revolt might explain why Naram-Sin was the first Akkadian king not to use the title King of Kish, preferring to use his new formulation, King of the Four Quarters of the Earth, which would continue to be used by regional rulers for the next 2,000 years. Oh yeah, no, we're not done yet. That was just Rebel King number 1. Naram-Sin then records that Amar-Girid, king of Uruk, raised an army against me, and mobilized Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Uma, Adab, Shurupak, Isin, and Nippur, all the way from the lower sea. In response, Naram-Sin hastened against him from Kish, and they made battle and grappled with one another. Naram-Sin was again victorious, seized Uruk, and diverted the Euphrates to flood the city. As far as tearing down Uruk's walls, well, his grandfather Sargon had already done that in the fight against Lugal-Zagassi. Once again, the rebel king himself managed to escape. Amar-Girid led the remnants of his army up the Euphrates to what Naram-Sin calls Bashar, the mountain of the Amorites, which I'll discuss a bit more later. Along the way, Amar-Girid tried to enlist support from the lords of the upper lands, i.e. the recently humbled rulers of Subartu, but they saw which way the winds were blowing and chose to stay on the sidelines. The only exception was the city of Mari, where a Mariote king named Migir-Dagan decided to join the rebellion, which was a bit ironic since Sargon had previously destroyed Mari, so this new iteration had likely been built by Naram-Sin. The ensuing battle at the Amorite Mountain was another victory for Naram-Sin, with another long list of dead and captured rebels. At the end of the campaign, Naram-Sin boasts a grand total of 80,940 slain or taken captive in battle. As the cherry on top, he also reports that he took prisoner in the battle Amar-Girid, king of Uruk, whom he brought in fetters before Enlil at Nippur, just like Sargon had done with his predecessor Lugal-Zagassi. In the wake of the conflict, Naram-Sin records that he made a likeness of himself, a gold statue for all time, to commemorate his might and the battles in which he was victorious, and dedicated it to Enlil in Nippur. By this time, Enlil's temple was getting pretty crowded, holding life-size statues of Ramush in tin, of Manishtushu in diorite, and now of Naram-Sin in gold. Anyway, that was the end of the Great Revolt. Actually, before I move on, there is one interesting side story involving Naram-Sin's aunt, Sargon's daughter Enheduanna. The story is embedded in one of her poems, and it goes a little something like this. Decades after being installed, Enheduanna was still serving as high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur. and she did write the moon god a hymn or two, but it's pretty obvious that her true devotion was to her hometown goddess Ishtar, the Sumerian Inanna. Not only did she devote 3 major works to Inanna, each one steeped in insane levels of superlative praise, but in one she actually elevates Inanna over An and Enlil, essentially casting her as head of the Sumerian pantheon. Which, if you're trying to make nice with the local Sumerians, is a fairly out-of-touch and generally no bueno move. So what exactly was going on? You might chalk it up to, you can take the girl out of a cod, but you can't take a cod out of the girl, but there was actually a little more to it. See, the king of Ur, Lugal-Ane, took part in the Great Revolt, and he used the opportunity to eject Enheduanna from her temple. She records the event in one of her poems, and the scene rings 100% true. As she writes, Lugal-Ane took the crown of the high priestess from me, giving me a knife and dagger instead. These suit you better, he said, which is almost Spartan in its pithy critique of the nature of Akkadian rule. Enheduanna then flees to a nearby cult center and throws herself a brief pity party. My Nana does not care for me, and so I waste away in this land of lies. Which I'm pretty sure are Cure lyrics, or possibly Morrissey. She then calls on Inanna to set things right. Let them know that you crush every rebel. Let them know that you grind skulls to dust. Let them know that you eat corpses like a lion. Let them know that you always stand triumphant. The eventual upshot and end of the poem sees Enheduanna restored to her role and giving all praise to Inanna, which is hard not to read as thanking Inanna's earthly representative, her own triumphant nephew, Naram-Sin. Wait, sorry, did I say earthly? Give Naram-Sin another minute. Quote, when the 4 quarters of the earth attacked him together, through the love Ishtar bore him, Naram-Sin was victorious in 9 battles in a single year, and captured the kings whom they had raised up against him. Because he defended his city in crisis, the people of his city asked of him that he be god of their city Akkad. And you may want to sit down for this, but Naram-Sin apparently accepted. Which explains why he started to wear horns on his helmet, and why he was comfortable getting up close and personal with Ishtar. From this time onward, Naram-Sin's name appears in texts preceded by the cuneiform sign derived from the image of a star, the Mesopotamian symbol of godhood. Like his predecessors, Naram-Sin also raised new temples to Ishtar, including one at Zabala and likely another at Babylon. The temple of Enlil and Nippur, known as the Eker, was the target of a major refurbishment, one so elaborate and grandiose that it took decades to complete. Up north, the king finished the rebuilding of Mari and placed it under direct control of an Akkadian military governor, or Shakanaku. So no more Mariot revolting, thank you very much. Per Foster, along with the huge new administrative fortress at Nagar, Naram-Sin built an even larger one at Assur on the Tigris River, another at Tutub on the Diyala, and another at Urasa Grig, between Nippur and the Tigris. He also embellished the one that Sargon had built at Eshnuna. All these sites featured palaces and temples, and Naram-Sin installed one son, Nabi-Ulmash, as governor at Tutub, and another, Sharati-Gubishin, as governor at Urasa Grig. The royal family may have also occupied a large estate at Mugdon near Kish that shows signs of refurbishment during Naram-Sin's reign. One of the most important and fruitful Akkadian endeavors was their occupation of Susiana, and especially of the former lowland Elamite capital of Susa. Per Foster, documents record that the city's Acropolis held a self-sustaining Akkadian enclave under the direction of an Akkadian governor, which may have been called Dur Agade, or Fortress Akkad. The enclave maintained a cult of Il-Abba and honored a quote-unquote deified standard, possibly a symbol of the Akkadian royal house. The large agricultural workforce was mainly Mesopotamian, but the documented presence of many foreigners, Marhashians, Lulubians, and Amorites, along with visitors from Dilmun, Magan, and Maluha, suggests that Susa was a major crossroads and commercial center, perhaps only second to Akkad. Excavations at Susa also unearthed the only surviving Akkadian treaty between Naram-Sin and a subordinate Elamite king. The treaty is sworn in the name of several dozen Elamite gods, including Inshushinak, the local equivalent of Ishtar and patron goddess of Susa. In the text, King Hita of Elam pledges that Naram-Sin's enemy is my enemy. Naram-Sin's friend is my friend, and I will not allow any disloyalty to Akkad. Further, he pledges to protect Akkad from evil with the army, i.e. provide a contingent of Elamite troops, and to place a statue of Naram-Sin in the temple of Inshushinak. To seal the treaty, the Elamite king gave Naram-Sin the hand of his daughter in marriage. And I know it's easy to blow right by, but it's actually worth taking note. The whole concept of diplomatic marriage was a fairly recent development. Per Amanda H. Podani, the earliest recorded mentions of the practice are from the northern city of Ebla, who also note its use by a few other cities. Per Podani, the tradition must have been reasonably effective in cementing relationships between kings, otherwise it surely would have died out. And being the innovative statesman he was, Naram-Sin was happy to give it a shot. I'm sure his current wife, Ishtar, took it all in stride. She's pretty open-minded like that. Naram-Sin fathered at least 10 children, at least 5 of whom were daughters. When his aunt Enheduanna died or retired, Naram-Sin installed his own daughter, Inanna, as high priestess of Nana at Ur. He also installed a second daughter, Tutanapshum, as high priestess of Enlil at Nippur, and a third, Shumshani, as high priestess of the sun god Utu at Sippar. Foster notes that, based on the pattern, he may have also installed other relatives at the heads of other important cults. We previously mentioned 2 of Naram-Sin's sons who were installed as Akkadian governors. The king also decided to leverage 2 daughters to strengthen his hold on the north. One daughter, Simat Ulmash, was married to the military governor or Shakanaku of the rebuilt city of Mari. Since the city was already under direct Akkadian control, the reason for the marriage is a bit unclear. It's possible the general, a man named Edidish, was personally close to the family. The second daughter, Terim Agad, was married to a prince of Urkesh, which is a good opportunity to dig a bit deeper on Urkesh and the Hurrians, which we'll do right after this short break.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks, or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Visit USAA.com/bundle.
Bundle savings are off total premium, not available in all states or in all situations. To qualify, auto policy must be active prior to property policy issue, subject to change. Restrictions apply. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Urkesh, modern Tel Mozan, Syria, was founded in the late 4th millennium BC, so shortly after the Kura Araxes/Hurrians first entered Subartu. Per Giorgio Bucalati and Marilyn Kelly Bucalati, one of the site's early prominent features was an elevated temple platform, and it may have gotten its start as a regional cult center. By 2500, Urkesh was a city of some 300 acres, larger than contemporary Ebla, and was encircled by walls some 20 feet high and 25 feet thick. The city's centerpiece was a massive temple to the chief Hurrian god, Kumarbi. In Hurrian mythology, the deity's children included the storm god Teshub, Shaushka, the goddess of love and war, Aranza, god of the Tigris, and a half-human offspring named Silver, obviously named for the precious metal that was mined in the northern mountains. The temple was followed by a second structure, a deep circular underground shaft ending in a vaulted chamber. As far as we know, this complex, known as the Abbey, was unique to Hurrian religion. Per the authors, it was only accessed by the royal family, and functioned as a sacred area where the spirits of the netherworld were summoned as part of complex rituals described in Hurrian texts. Interestingly, at the time Naram-Sin defeated its king Tishatal, Urkesh had no royal palace. If the ruling family lived in the city, their residence was apparently unremarkable, which is tempting to see as an egalitarian holdover from their Kura Araxes forebears. It's also possible they resided elsewhere and only visited Urkesh periodically to fulfill a cultic function. In fact, even calling Tishatal a king is probably imprecise. Per the authors, the Hurrian name for their ruler, Endon, may be more akin to high priest or even chief representative. Whatever it meant was apparently important. Not only was Endon the only non-Sumero-Akkadian title used in the region, but Akkadian kings permitted its use right down through the end of the empire. Sometime during Naram-Sin's reign, Tishatal was succeeded by a son named Tupkish. And once the new Endon came to power, he started building Urkesh's first palace, one connected to and aligned with both the Kumarbi temple and the mysterious underground abbey. The palace was likely an attempt to embrace, or, be seen as embracing, Sumero-Akkadian norms. But there's even a more likely proximate cause: the pending arrival of Naram-Sin's daughter, the Akkadian princess Taramagad. I mean, if you're marrying your son to the daughter of an Akkadian god king, you probably want to keep her in the style to which she's grown accustomed, for which a very spiffy royal palace is kind of an opening bet. For his part, by marrying his daughter to an Urkesh prince, Naram-Sin was acknowledging the city's importance as both a major Hurrian cult center and an access point for coveted northern resources. He even expanded Tupkish's brief by granting him the title King of Urkesh and Nagar. Though, since Nagar was now basically just a huge fortified Akkadian administrative center, it was really a promotion in name only. In addition to the attention paid to the north, far more than his Akkadian predecessors, Naram-Sin was equally dedicated to managing affairs in the south. First, as I already mentioned, the king had sealed a major treaty by marrying an Elamite princess, a reflection of that region's growing importance. Of all the marriages of his royal children, the most consequential was that of the Akkadian crown prince, Shar-Kali Shari. And of all the lands of the Four Quarters and beyond, Naram-Sin decided to marry his son to a princess of Marhashi. It's a place I've mentioned a few times before, but it's time to dig in a bit deeper. Let's start with a recap. During his initial conquest of Susa, Sargon had fought and defeated an alliance of Elam and Marhashi, including the Marhashi king's brother and 2 of his generals. During Ramusha's reign, Marhashi raised soldiers from the Indus Valley and joined with Elam in their bid to retake Susiana. Ramush had recorded his subsequent victory over Abal-Gamash, king of Marhashi, and also claims to have torn out the foundations of Marhashi from the land of Elam. And early in his own reign, Naram-Sin affirmed his control over all the land of Elam as far as Marhashi. Marhashi. So, aside from being fun to say, what do we know about the kingdom? Luckily for us, quite a bit. Marhashi was centered on the Halil River Valley in modern south-central Iran, about 500 miles east of Elamite Anshan. Its proximity to the modern city of Jiroft gives Marhashi its more common name, the Jiroft culture. Its ancient capital, whose name is lost, was located at Konar Sandal, where excavations uncovered a cultic building and a fortified citadel. Per Roger Matthews and Hassan Faseli Nashli, entrance to the citadel was through a gateway with a semicircular tower plus an anteroom or shrine holding a unique engaged monumental painted sculpture depicting a male skirted and bare-chested figure, possibly a Marhashi deity. Beyond Konar Sandal north and south, the kingdom included the major sites of Tepe Bampur, Shaddad, and Tepe Yahya. Per Matthews and Nashli, in all, around 300 tell sites have been surveyed in the region, some reaching 100 hectares in area, evidence of significant settlement during the 3rd millennium BC. The region's been characterized as a small Mesopotamia, due to its hot, humid summers and relatively mild winters, as well as its high agricultural productivity. Recovered Marhashi finds include carved bowls, vessels, statuettes, and handbag-shaped ritual objects made of a local stone called chlorite. Roughly 100 such vessels have been recovered from Mesopotamia, mostly in temple settings. Per the authors, the Marhashi also produced inlaid footed goblets, lapis lazuli amulets, and bronze vessels decorated in high relief. An elaborate bronze staff, around 3 feet long and decorated with shell inlays, was recovered from an elite Marhashi grave. It may have once been the scepter of a Marhashi king. Per Matthews and Nashli, Marhashi art was largely inspired by regional myths and legends. Their heroes are often hybrid figures, half man and half lion, bull, or scorpion, and are shown fighting snakes, scorpions, bulls, leopards, and other wild animals. A game board recovered from Konar Sandal is shaped like a scorpion man. Another piece from a nearby cemetery may depict a regional variant of the Near Eastern flood myth. Other imagery is clearly sourced from the local flora and fauna, including palm trees, eagles, goats, panthers, lions, scorpions, and snakes, sometimes weaved into geometric patterns, as well as architectural facades that may represent early stepped Marhashi temples. Marhashi and Mesopotamia had had some kind of contacts going back to the early 3rd millennium, and they'd only grown stronger since. An Akkadian-era vase fragment recovered from Uruk shows a nude-bound Marhashi prisoner with pointed beard and vertical braid, pulled along by a nose ring. A pedestaled goblet from a later period shows another bound Marhashi prisoner, with the same telltale features, escorted by a band of Central Asian warriors. So not only did the Marhashi get around, but capturing one was apparently a big deal. They were also, surprise, surprise, talented musicians. Inscriptions refer to a musical style, or possibly an instrument, described as being from Marhashi, that was celebrated as far afield as Syria. Though the Marhashi had their own distinct culture, one that drew from Central Asia, the IVC, and other parts of Iran, they often allied militarily with the neighboring Elamites, with whom there's another interesting connection. Per Matthews and Nashley, 3 tablets recovered near Konar Sandal held texts in an early form of a script called Linear Elamite. But they predate the first known use of that script by the Elamite king Puzur-Inshushinak by some 200 or 300 years. So it's at least possible that the Linear Elamite script began in Marhashi. To the best of our knowledge, the kingdom of Marhashi had never been invaded or conquered. And with the Akkadian annexation of Elam, the two polities now shared an effective border. In fact, by the latter years of Naram-Sin's reign, Marhashi may have been the Akkadian Empire's most powerful remaining rival. So marrying his son to a Marhashi princess was a totally reasonable move, and a good way to keep the current Marhashi king, Hupshum-Kipi, from getting too rambunctious. Well, at least that was the plan. In 2218 BC, after 37 years of rule, Naram-Sin passed away. Or at least, departed the earthly realm to join with his fellow gods. Upon which the crown prince Shar-Kali-Shari, king of all kings, assumed the Akkadian throne. So, quick survey. Brothers ruling as provincial governors? Check. Sisters at the heads of powerful cults? Check. Other sisters set up in the north? Check. Married to a Marhashi princess who was now the Akkadian queen? Check. Oh, and let's jump right in with the deification. If it's okay with everyone, I'd like to be known as Shar-Kali-Shari, the heroic god of Akkad. Cool? Great. You guys are the best. Per Foster, the king started off his reign by being crowned at the Ekur temple by his sister Tutanapshum, the high priestess of Enlil. He then made a slow royal progress through Sumer, where he and his queen Tuta-Shar-Libish were lavishly feted by a raft of Akkadian nobles. In a not-so-subtle show of military strength, the couple were accompanied throughout their tour by 5 Akkadian generals. Along with ongoing work at the Ekur temple, Shar-Kali-Shari commissioned new work at the temples of Ishtar and Ilaba at Babylon. Per Foster, Babylon may have only begun to develop as a major urban center around this time, perhaps taking advantage of Naram-Sin's harsh treatment of neighboring Kish. Also, like his grandfather Manish-Tushu, Shar-Kali-Shari purchased arable land to pass around to his nobles. A surviving record lists the major events of Shar-Kali-Shari's reign. The first 10 years are mostly focused on his work at the Ekur temple. But starting in 2007 BC, there's a definite change in tone. Year in which the yoke was imposed on Gutium. Year in which Shar-Kali-Shari captured Shar-Lagab, the king of Gutium. Year in which Shar-Kali-Shari was victorious over Mar-2 at the Bashar mountain. And, most alarmingly, year in which Shar-Kali-Shari brought the battle against Elam and Marhashi in front of Akshak and was victorious. I mean, he's talking about victories, so no red flags. And there's no hint of anything even remotely resembling the Great Revolt. But either way, we need to unpack these a bit. As I mentioned earlier, the Guti were less an ethnic group than a general term for the tribes of the central Zagros. Despite their frequent depiction as wild barbarians descending from the mountains for violent raids, the primary mode of Guti interaction was peaceful, large-scale migration. By the reign of Shar-Kali-Shari, several southeastern Sumerian cities had sizable Guti populations. At some point, they came to control the city of Adab and basically made it their capital. Now, Adab had rebelled against both Ramush and Naram-Sin, so the city, its leadership, and its general population had largely been eviscerated, which may have presented an opening for Guti domination. Shar-Kali-Shari's actions were likely spurred by the elevation of one of their own as Gutian king, upon which he defeated the Gutians, captured the king, and reaffirmed the city's vassal status. Next, let's turn to the Amorites. Earlier this episode, we introduced Bashar, the Mountain of the Amorites, where Naram-Sin had finally defeated the rebel king of Uruk. Bashar, or Jebel Bishri, is actually a range of mountains just west of the Euphrates, about halfway between Mari and Ebla, which, given that local Amorites got their start as settlers from both cities, makes a good deal of sense. Despite its fairly evocative name, the Amorite mountain was not an Amorite homeland or a seat of Amorite culture. Per Aaron A. Burke, surveys demonstrate that the region had no substantial permanent settlement during the 3rd millennium BC. What it actually was a frequent refuge and gathering place for groups of Amorite raiders. I've laid quite a bit of groundwork that, despite the climate still being supportive, the fragile crescent the Amorites worked had been thoroughly ravaged by war. It was pretty clear who the enemy was. You just had to look at the flattened cities or the massive new structure at Nagar. And even though Naram-Sin had refounded Mari, the new version was less of a market city than a glorified Akkadian outpost. Given the rather grim situation, the Amorites needed new revenue streams to make up for some devastating losses. And if they could take that wealth from their enemies, so much the better. Some had fought as mercenaries during the Great Revolt, but that was a rare situation. A more reliable strategy was raiding and/or getting protection money from northern merchants who were transporting goods to Akkad. Shar-Kali-Shari's mention of defeating the Mar-2 at the Bashar mountain likely refers to a punitive strike that was meant to deter such activity. The local campaign was probably led by the king's brother-in-law, Ididish, the Akkadian Shakanaku of Mari. It also likely had little enduring effect. By the way, if you're wondering why I'm leaning into their story a bit, I'll give you a bit of a spoiler. The future is Amorite, my friends. Just ask Shamshi Adad and Hammurabi. The unkindest cut came closer to home, and I mean that in multiple respects. While Shar-Kali-Shari was focused on the Guti and Amorites, the kingdom of Marhashi used the opportunity to liberate the Elamite highland territories of Anshan. They then enlisted their grateful allies in a major western campaign. Marching either through the Zagros Mountains or along the adjacent Mesopotamian plain, the coalition army soon reached the Diyala River. In fact, by the time Shar-Kali-Shari learned of the threat, the Marhashi and Elamites were just a few miles from Akkad, which to me is just totally insane. To the king's credit, he somehow managed to rally his forces and pull together a defense. A major battle was fought near Akshak, at the confluence of the Tigris and Diyala rivers, and Shar-Kali-Shari apparently emerged victorious. Though I'm guessing that dinner that night with his Marhashi queen was either much louder or much quieter than usual. Approaching the year 2000 BC, the Akkadian Empire was militarily strong and economically healthy, with good connections to the Persian Gulf and the northern highlands, and with the Guti, Amorites, Marhashi, and Elamites all seemingly put in their place. In addition to the entries I listed earlier, inscriptions mark several more years of Shar-Kali-Shari's reign without really giving us any details. Then, right at the dawn of the new millennium, the record goes ominously silent. If you recall from 2 episodes back, this is exactly what happened in contemporary Egypt at almost the exact same time. And, as I mentioned then, there is one major worldwide event that coincides almost precisely. The onset of a century of increased dryness and decreased rainfall in the Fragile Crescent, called the 4.2 kiloyear BPE aridification event. So we'll be taking our leave of Mesopotamia this season at the beginning of the end of the Akkadian Empire. When I return to the series later this year, we'll unleash the full force of the aridification event and watch its impact on the cultures we've covered, and a few new ones, over the next few centuries. If you can't wait that long for your Ancient World fix, there's always subscribing to Patreon. I'll still be producing monthly mini-episodes for my Lugal tier Patreon supporters. The episodes will cover topics like the Royal Cemetery of Ur, the structure of the Akkadian military, the refoundation of the Ekur Temple, and the Curse of Agade that I didn't have time for this season. So that's it for now. Please stay subscribed, be safe, be well, and thanks again for listening. Would you like to listen to ad-free episodes of The Ancient World and a bunch of other great history podcasts? Then go to The Ancient World Podcast on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Airwave History Plus. You'll get a free 7-day trial to listen to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and more from the largest collection of history podcasts anywhere. So subscribe to Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts today.